स्वाध्याय टीवी डॉक्टर बाबासाहेब आंबेडकर ओपन यूनिवर्सिटी.
Namaskar dear students, I Dr. Himanshu Patel welcome you from the Chaitanya studio of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University. We are in lecture series on mobile application development in Android. Before we start, let us look at the what we have discussed in last session. In last session, we have learned SQLite database, which can be used to design persistent data access mechanism within your Android application. We have learned how to open and close database, how to create table in database dynamically, how to establish relationship between them, how to specify constraint, how to perform insert, update, delete, select all records and select particular record, and we make use of cursor to retrieve record for processing. So, in today's session, we learn another approach for storing user preferences. So, we can use shared preferences to store user preferences. So, today's topic is shared preferences. Today, we learn how to use shared preference for storing application state, simple user information, configuration option and other such information. It is very useful to store user preference, so that next time user comes in your application, he gets all the preferences by him. So, what is shared preferences? We can say it is a lightweight data storage mechanism to help you save simple application data. Let us understand by one example. For example, your application may have an option to allow user to specify text for welcome message, hide or show welcome message and change background and foreground color for your layout. This kind of information, which is user preference, can be stored in shared preference. Shared preference is a class. So, package for shared preference is android.content. You have to import these package for using shared preferences. What type of value we can store in shared preferences? The answer is you can store boolean values, float values, integer values, long values or string values. Any of these value can be stored as a user preference. For example, hiding and showing welcome message is set to true or false using boolean value. For example, welcome message may be string value and show or hide welcome message is a boolean value, and you can also store your other preferences like float, integer and long. Now, we have to follow certain steps for using shared preferences. First of all, you have to retrieve an instance of shared preference object. Then you have to create editor to modify preference content, that means putting content into shared preference. Then you have to make changes to preference using this editor, and finally, you save or commit your changes. So, 4 steps involved in using shared preference. Now, we can have private and shared preferences. What is private preferences? These preferences are for the specific activity and only used by that activity. It is not shared with other activity within the application. So, such type of preferences are called private preferences. Shared preferences, as its name suggests, are shared among activities within package. Now, to get these private preferences, you can use get preferences method. You have to specify mode as a private and it returns instance of shared preference object. Once you get this shared preference object, you can also edit or put content inside these shared preferences, and to get shared preferences, we have method get shared preferences. The first argument specifies the name of preference which is stored in form of file. So, this is how you can create instance of private or shared preference. Difference is clear. Private preferences are used by particular activity, shared preferences are used by all activities within your application. Now, once you get these shared preference instance or object, you can call these methods to perform various operations. For example, you want to see whether specific preference exists by name, then you can use contains method and it takes the name of preference to be searched. Then we have edit method which retrieves editor to change these preferences, and these editor has a certain methods to put content inside shared preference. Then we have get all method which retrieves map of all preference key value pair, means every preference has a name and value which is already discussed. Get boolean will get boolean type of preference and you have to specify name of preference. Similarly, get float, get integer, get long and get string retrieves preference by name of respective type. Once you have get editor, you can put different values inside shared preferences. There are put methods like put boolean, put float, put integer, put long, put string, etc. to set preference by name. You have to specify preference and its value inside this put method. Suppose you want to remove all preferences, you can use clear method. To remove particular preference, you can use remove method, and once these values are put inside your shared preference, you have to call commit method to commit or save all changes from these editing session. We have one shared preference object and once is editor object that used together to retrieve and stored preference. Now, let us take one example. Here you can see settings is the object of type shared preference and we call get preference method. These method, as we discussed earlier, is used to get private preference. So, mode is a private, and once this object is available settings, you can call its edit method to retrieve editor. So, editor is a type of object editor and we get this editor by calling shared preference method edit, and once we have this editor available, you can put shared preference inside these using put method. So, here we write down editor dot put long, first is the name of preference which is sum long and 10,000 is a value which is stored for these preference sum long, and once you have put all these values, you can finally commit your changes by calling editor's commit method. So, we write down editor dot commit. Suppose I want to put welcome message inside these shared preference, I can instead of sum long I write down welcome, and instead of 10,000 I have to write down string, instead of put long I have to use put string. So, this is how you can use your preferences. Like database file is stored in particular path, we have also preferences stored as a file. Internally application preferences are stored as XML file. Now, how to get these files? You can access the preferences file using Android device monitor using the file explorer. When you go to file explorer, you find these files on Android file system in directory called data/data/ your package name /shared preference, and whatever name you specify in get shared preference method will be stored as a file name and its extension is XML. So, you can easily get different files for different preferences in this directory, where package name is the package name of your application and remaining are fixed path, and preference file name is the file name that you specify while retrieving or opening shared preference or private preference. So, this is how preference are stored on device. You have to get value from user for preferences using certain layout file, but Android provides XML driven framework to create system style preference screen for your application. Using these framework, you can ensure that the preference activities in your application are consistent with those used in both native and other third party application. In earlier example, we assume that we take inputs for preference from user by creating our own layout, but in this case the layout for getting preference is a XML file, and you can use this XML file to create consistent look and feel for your application similar to other application in your phone. What is advantage of preference framework? So, user will be familiar with layout and use of your application setting screen. These application framework provides layout which is very similar to your setting screen. So, user will be more familiar and easy to know what to specify in these preferences. You can integrate setting screen from other application into your application setting screen. Now, how to do this we will learn later on. In preference activity framework, we have to specify three things. First is a preference screen layout which defines the hierarchy displayed in your preference activity. It specifies the controls to display, the values to allow, and the shared preference keys to use for each user interface control. So, like we creating our layout for accepting user input, we have preference screen layout for accepting preferences. So, this is defined as a XML file inside your resource folder within XML folder. Next is a preference activity. So, like we extend activity to represent normal activity, we extend preference activity to specify preference activity, and it will be used to host your application preference screen. Normal activity host your user layout, preference activity host your application preference screen. Whenever changes are made in these preferences, we have shared preference change listener to listen for changes to shared preference. It is very similar to your basic preference, but only difference is here we have screen layout specified as a XML file. What type of preference you can define using this preference activity framework? So, answer is list preference, that is used to display value selected from the list of items. Checkbox preference to allow user to check particular item for preference. We can get text for using edit text preferences, and by ringtone preference user have flexibility for selecting ringtones. So, these are the example of XML preference that you can define inside your XML file. When you define these preferences as a XML file, you have to use certain attributes. So, on screen you can see that there are certain attributes that we have to use for defining these preferences. So, very first is important Android key. It is a name for or key for the option. So, by using these name you refer these value inside your program. So, key is the most important, then comes title. So, it is a title of the option, then summary, it is a short summary of the option. In case of list preference, we are providing user with multiple text items from which user have to select. So, entry specifies text of the item in the list, and when these particular item is selected, it returns its value. So, these values are defined inside entry values. So, these two are required in case of list preferences. Then certain preferences are displayed as a dialog. For example, edit text preference. So, what will be the title of the dialog is specified by Android dialog attribute, and there is a default value attribute which specifies default value of the option from the list of item. For example, I have 3 items for specifying background red, green and blue, and I want to ensure that by default background color should be green. So, I can specify these inside this default value, and remember text displayed in list is different and its value returned is a different thing. So, you have to manage accordingly. So, these are the attributes that we will use for defining XML preferences. Today, to clearly understand what is a shared preference and what is a shared preference activity framework, we write down two programs. One, we write down application that defines activity with necessary layout. We allow user to set text for welcome message, message text color and background color as a shared preference. But remember, in this case, we accept input from user for all these preferences by defining one layout inside setting activity, and inside main activity we fetch this shared preference and apply background color, text color, message etc. on layout control. Setting activity is a different activity which accepts input from user for preferences, and main activity where we actually apply these settings. And remember, here we have not used preference activity framework, but we define our layout manually. But in second program, we implement above functionality using preference activity framework. We define our layout as a XML file inside resource XML folder. Let us start. As mentioned earlier, we have two activities for our program. One is setting activity and another is a main activity. So, I have already created one project. So, let us understand first by layout. On screen you can see here is a two activities. One is a my preference activity, which you can say it is a main activity, and another is a setting activity that actually accepts preferences from user. First we understand my preference activity. Here on screen you can see layout for our preference activity. So, here is a just welcome message which displays welcome to shared preference demo, and one button is there with name settings. So, by clicking on this button we open our settings activity layout file or start setting activity, and once this button is clicked, it will open this layout as a activity where we accept preferences of user. So, here is a text view which displays enter welcome message, and below it is a edit text that actually accepts welcome message. For foreground color we have used spinner with three values red, green and blue, and for background color we have cyan, yellow and magenta. You can use any color for, but here basic idea is to accept foreground color and background color from user using spinner. So, we get three preferences from user. One is welcome message, another is foreground color and last is a background color. And when user set particular value or enter particular value in these fields, then user can press this set preference button. So, our preferences are stored inside file, and then we return back to this layout where actually these settings are applied. So, let us start from my preference activity. Here is a my preference activity. So, here we define one object called shared preference to get instance of shared preference. We have relative layout in which we apply our background color. We have text view to display message, and this is our setting button. So, inside on create first we set our content view, then we get reference for relative layout, text view and button in design mode, and here we write down one function called update user interface from preferences, reads preferences stored by setting activity and apply same on our layout. So, we understand these update user interface from preferences method first. So, here is a method called update user interface from preferences. These get shared preference method will open preference with these name my preferences, and here is a mode. You can see second is a mode. So, here we specify 0 in case of shared preferences. And here I use get method because we assume that user have already stored that preference using setting activity. So, here we just retrieve these values. So, in FG we write down preference dot get integer and its name is FG. So, in setting activity we refers foreground color as a FG. So, this is a default value which is a 0. If foreground is not set, it may be considered as a 0. Then we have integer BG which get integer value from BG preference which specifies background color, and if it is not specified, default value is 0. And inside MSG variable we get string with MSG which is our welcome message. This is a default message if it is not provided by user. So, it is a welcome to shared preference demo which is shown by default. Then we have all preferences available. Now, we can apply it on our layout. So, I write down message dot set text MSG, which means whatever message stored inside preference will be displayed in text view, and if it is not set, it will be displayed welcome to shared preference demo. Then we apply foreground color. So, here I write down if FG is 0, then my foreground or text color is a red, then 1 which represent green and 2 which represent blue. So, 0, 1 and 2 is used to store red, green and blue. Similarly, for background we have cyan, magenta and yellow, and 0 represents cyan color, 1 represent magenta color and 2 represents yellow color. For example, assume that we have not called setting activity earlier. So, what will happen? This will create this file, then default value 0 0 and stored in FG, and inside MSG it stores welcome to shared preference. So, this is how it updates preference stored by settings activity. Now, when this setting button is clicked, we open that setting activity. For that we have use intent. So, intent I represent activity settings activity. So, here in intent we have to specify two argument. First is a context and second is a activity that we want to start. So, when setting button is pressed, it will start setting activity to accept user preferences, and start activity with intent I will actually open that activity. Now, when this activity is opened, when setting button is pressed, this layout is displayed that I explained already. Now, let us understand what happens when user press this set preference. So, for that we have to go to setting activity.java file. Here is a setting activity.java file. Here we have two spanners, one button and one edit text, and again you have to require shared preference object to store value inside shared preference. For that we have taken this prefs object. Now, inside on create we have taken reference for both the spinner, button and message which is edit text, and we fill adapter from string resource array that I have already created. Now, you also know how to get string array resource from string array.xml file. So, these two line will fill our spinner with colors. In first spinner we have red, green, blue, and in second spinner we have cyan, magenta and yellow. Now, when these save preference button is pressed, we have called save preference method to simplify code. So, here is a save preference method. What we have to do is, we have to open preference using get shared preference, and it is a file name. My preference is a file name by which our preferences are stored in XML file. So, my preference file will be created. Here we have to put value entered in user control in shared preference. So, we call editor method, editor object using preference.edit method, and once we have editor object, we can put string with these name from edit text, foreground with get selected item position, which is index for our value or item, and inside BG we store whatever item selected in background spinner. So, all these values are put inside editor method. Remember, in last you have to compulsory call commit method, otherwise it will not be saved. So, editor.commit will save these 3 changes that we have fetch inside my preference activity, and finally, we just display toast to user that settings are saved, and then we go back to our original activity where these activity is generated. So, here we create one intent which opens this my preference activity, and we start this activity, and whatever changes made here will be updated using that update user interface from preference method. So, this is how our preference works. Inside setting activity, we have set our preferences, and inside my preference activity, we have updated our interface using this method update user interface from preferences, where we actually fetch these preferences stored by setting activity. So, let us see how this actually works. So, here on screen you can see by default my preference activity starts, and when I press this setting button, it will open our setting activity. Here I write down welcome to BAOU, and my foreground color is a green and my background color is yellow. Now, I press this set preference button. So, it will store all these inside MSG, FG and BG in shared preference, and when I press this set preference button, it will also open these activity. So, here you can see changes, background is changed to yellow and this text changed to welcome to BAOU, and you can also see its foreground color or text color is changed to green. So, this is how you can accept preferences from user, store it in preference and retrieve it in your layout. You can fetch these preferences in any activity within your application. In second program, we write down same functionality, but using preference activity framework. So, let us learn how to use this preference activity framework. Here on screen you can see there are 2 activities, one is called set preference activity and another is show XML preference activity. This second activity is similar to our main activity, and these set preference activity extends preference activity. Let us start with this main activity show XML preference activity. Here is a layout for our show XML preference activity. Here is a one text view which displays my XML preference by default, and one button is there which is used to set preferences. So, whenever this my preferences button is pressed, this set preference activity is called. So, we go to Java file when what will happen when this button is pressed. So, here is a show XML preference activity. Here is a button, text view and layout that represent button, text view and layout at design time, and here is a intent. First we set this layout and take reference for button, text and relative layout. Like previous example, we have here set preferences method that renders preference on layout. So, let us understand set preference method. Here is a method called set preferences which actually sets our preferences on layout. So, here we take instance of shared preference using preference manager instead of using get preference or get shared preference method. So, in case of preference activity framework, you have to use this method to get preference instance. Next, we declare one variable CLR to get background color and default value is 0. If 0, we have to set background color red. If it is 1, we have to set background color green, and if it is 2, we have to set background color blue as in previous example. Likewise, we have a boolean preference which is decides whether to display title or not, and default value is true, remember. So, if title is true, we display welcome message by setting its visibility to visible, and if it is false, we set its visibility to invisible, and we get whatever message we want to displayed in this text view using getString method, and our key name is message and default value is my XML preference, and whatever value stored in this message is displayed as a text for text view. So, this is how we update user interface based on preferences set by user. When this button is pressed, which is my preferences, we actually accepts user preferences using preference activity. So, here in intent we have called this method set preference activity, and instead of start activity we use start activity for results, and 0 is the ID of this activity, and whenever this activity, that is setting preference, is finished, we apply same on our main layout. So, here we call set preferences method, and then we start our original activity or main activity to apply these preferences. So, this is how our main activity works. In set preference activity, here we extend preference activity instead of activity, and inside on create we use add preference from resources instead of using set content view, because these my preference files defines our layout for preference. So, how to do that we learn. If you see, this is our resource folder, and inside resource folder you have to create one folder with name XML, and inside that by right clicking on it you have to create one file to store your preference. Here is a new, and you have to press XML resource file. So, here I define my preferences which is displayed by add preference from resource method. So, here is our XML file. The first topmost element is a preference screen element, and you can specify key, title and summary for these. What is important is how to define list preference. So, here we have list preference and its key is bg color. Remember, to get these we use get method with this name bg color. If you go to show XML preference activity, here you can see the same name is used to get background color. So, key is the most important, and using key we retrieve this preference, and its title is background, its summary is select color. Its entries are specified in array with name bg, and where to define this array, we know that inside value folder we have array.xml file. So, here you can see string array with bg and 3 values red, green and blue, and here is a another array which represent these value as a integer 0, 1 and 2. So, here to display text we use text and to retrieve value we use integer values. Our dialog title is select background color and by default green color is selected. So, we have write down default value as a 1. Then we define one checkbox preference to decide whether we want to display title or not. So, our key is title. Title for this is display title. We are asking user whether you want to display title or not, and summary is if check title will be displayed, means if it is checked title will be displayed. And finally, to display welcome message we have edit text preference. Here key is message. So, inside get string method you have to use this value, title is message, summary is set the welcome message, and our dialog title is welcome message. Now, how these will be displayed, let us see in emulator by running this activity. Here on screen you can see here is our title with default value, here is a button my preferences, and whenever I click this that preference activity opens. So, I clicking this. So, remember first is a list preference, second is a checkbox preference, and third is a edit text preference. So, how it will look like, you can see it looks professional or similar to your settings. So, by clicking on this we can have this dialog box open, and last time I specify blue. So, it displays blue. So, here I am selecting green, and whether I want to display title or not, if it is checked title is displayed. So, I am removing this check mark, means title should not be displayed, and inside message you can change your message. So, here I write down welcome to BAOU and then I press OK. So, when I finish this activity it will reopen our main activity and apply all these changes to our layout. So, remember background color is a green, title should not be displayed, and message is also not applied because we are not displaying title. So, here I am finishing this activity. So, here you can see now our welcome message is gone because it is not displayed. So, you want to redisplay it, you can always use this button, and here you can check, here you can change color to red, and you can also change this message. So, now again I go to my original activity by finishing this activity. So, now you can see background color is changed to red, my text changed to welcome to BAOU, and it is also displayed. So, this is how shared preference activity works. Let us summarize what we have learned today. We learn how to access shared preferences, how to edit and save your shared preferences, how to use preference activity framework for defining preferences as an XML resources. I hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you and happy learning.
स्वाध्याय टीवी